We're back.
We're back.
That's lucky.
There's been a lot of talk about compliance, and of course that is the most pressing issue, to be compliant to the legislation. But there is an end game, and e-invoicing is just, the compliance is just the first step when you can start to take advantage of e-invoicing. And so now we're going to go through different steps of evolutionary steps, or readiness steps. Just to give, it's one way of looking at it, to give you an idea what is in front of you, and to show you the potential that comes with e-invoicing. So this is this ladder of readiness, where we have the first part is just be able to comply. That is the first thing that is necessary. And then we going now to go through these steps upwards, to build knowledge, expand usage, take advantage, and the next steps after even that. So
we'll try to give you some examples from some different member states as we progress. It is clear for us also now that we visited most of the countries is that they regard themselves very differently. So you have one level of maturity or readiness from a national point of view, but from a cross-border international point of view, it could be a whole different case. Mm-hmm.
So compliance, this is something that we talked about a lot today. So if a supplier wants to send an electronic invoice, they're using any of these technical syntaxes, you must have the means to receive, and therefore you must have a solution in place to process and receive invoices. And the word process here is of course up for what does that mean? And we've had some horrible examples of countries that said, yes, our process is that we print the invoice and we process it in paper. And that's not the intention with this. But anyway, you need to have a solution in place for receiving and process. So the supplier needs to be able to connect, take interoperability into account, particularly cross-border. The whole point of the legislation and having it as a directive is that it will help the internal market, help to have suppliers from foreign suppliers able to use their own tools. They don't have to adapt to every new market they are entering. So this is an infrastructural question for Europe. And it's a good idea to align with other countries. And I think Ireland is a very, very good example on this. That is, yes, reusing standardized components, not inventing stuff at home that becomes proprietary for the country. And here on the processing side, the ambition level differs greatly, as I mentioned. And if you want to have full automation, we will give you examples. One of the breakout sessions will be about a little bit about this, how to integrate with full automation. Then you also need to do changes in your internal organizations and so on. So comply, receive and process. This is step one.
And I think that for most, as we saw in one of the first slides in your section, for most of the countries that have transposed the directive on a central governmental level, they are at least on this first step of the staircase. Second step, build knowledge.
Yes, it's one thing to receive invoices, but if you want to start to build up the volumes, you also need to know internally what e-invoicing is about. So you need to have a communication plan internally and also towards your suppliers. I showed you some examples on websites how the Swedish Coast Guard is informing on their contact. Even I have examples of Swedish municipalities who have their Peppol ID on the front page of the municipality's website. If you scroll down to the bottom of the start page on the website, you have perhaps the telephone number to the municipality and the address and the Peppol ID. So that's how they push it as a concept. Support from management is necessary. Often a reason why some organizations are slow movers, because it's a grassroots movement with just someone in the organization that has this on their table, but not really anybody pushing or asking questions there. So, but create awareness, work with explaining the benefits, plan for the future, and start thinking about training the staff about the new systems and softwares that's necessary. And externally, keep information straightforward to the suppliers. Also explain the benefits. And align the strategies on country level. If one municipality says something, it's very good if the neighboring municipality has a similar message. Otherwise, the suppliers will get confused. Also, we have examples of that where everybody is taking this very seriously and they send information to the suppliers. And we had a case where one supplier said, "Stop sending me information." They had received 200 letters informing them about e-invoicing. Before, in Sweden, we have mandatory, on the mandatory side, to send electronic invoices. So it was very important to inform, but it can go overboard too. So have a strategy on that.
But for those of you who are here in the room, you are in great luck, because from central government and Office for Governmental Procurement, they have produced loads of different excellent material for you to reuse and utilize towards the suppliers. So already there, you are on a fast track. At least you have the possibility to step on it if you want to. Another thing,
we are using standardized components. Also, the e-delivery of PEPL, the infrastructure is standardized. You can refer to the solutions rather than pointing to specific commercial products. This is also a good thing. We've seen also many cases where a big buying organization says that if you want to send electronic invoices to us, go to this website where you can purchase a license from this commercial company. And that's not, it is an open market with competitive solutions. So it's better to refer to the European standard and PEPL, and then the suppliers will find a suitable solution themselves. And then we come to the expanding usage. So you're starting to build up the knowledge. Now you're starting to, in the outreach and to connect. One thing to consider then is, in your case, since you don't have a mandatory electronic invoicing, you have to work for onboarding new suppliers. And one way of looking at it is to check your suppliers, how many invoices do they send, what type of suppliers are they, and build a strategy around that. How mature are they, and how do you want to process? Come up with a strategy on how to contact them. Should you prioritize a few to have actually calling them or have meetings, or should you just send out a general information? Also, on the onboarding, avoid a process which requires a lot of manual intervention. So if each onboarding becomes a small project, then it will be an incentive not to continue to onboard, because it becomes a headache, it's a lot of work. So think of streamlining this process and so it doesn't become a burden. And just looking at an example here, these are fake numbers, but it's a typical distribution of invoices where you have the number of suppliers, or suppliers on this scale, and the number of invoices that send, and then you will have a few suppliers who are sending you a lot of invoices. That would be like the telecom and the utility, so on. And then you have, and these are the prime candidates for full automation in the end, to really take advantage of. Here you're spending a lot of time processing these invoices. You can, when you have them on board, you can start going downward. But then you have a long tail of suppliers that sends only a few invoices. But you want them also to be electronic, so there should be you have a strategy where you don't have to talk to them individually, but at the same time, the onboarding must be simple and shouldn't be requiring you to do a lot of work, because in that case, you would not bother with them. We have examples where if you have a solution which is costly for every onboarding, that perhaps you pay 50 euros for every new suppliers you connect, then you quickly come to the conclusion that if you only send a few invoices a year, then there's no point going to electronic invoices. You have to pay a fixed fee. So it's become an anti-incentive.
And
And in PEPL, normally that type of pricing isn't. Since it's dynamic addressing, you connect through your systems, you don't have to do these manual setups and therefore no fees.
From a historical point of view, and as you heard this morning with the methods of exchange, you'll find that those sending a lot of invoices typically have already their own integrations in place, or will even do their own thing with PEPL, whereas the long tail there has probably been using some kind of portal or any other legacy system
to key in
to
the
key
invoice.
in
And I understand that is also
invoice.
part of the
yeah, so it's finding a right mixture and balance here, and what are the tools we can offer to them to get the adoption rate high enough to have a full coverage, so we leave nobody behind, and also get the long tail with the micro SMEs or even the companies sending few invoices.
So let's now say that you have reached a certain level of volumes of invoices, and you want to start to make the processing more and more efficient. Then we have several enablers in the European standard which can help you to automate the handling of the invoice. Since the data in the invoice is structured, you can use it to control the invoice and to match the invoice automatically. And I'll give you a few examples. So this picture here describes how an invoice is coming from the left. Your service provider is receiving it. This buyer here has an e-invoicing workflow that takes the invoice, it hands it over to the purchaser, who then assesses it and hands it over perhaps to his boss for approval. And then finally, information is transferred over to the accounting system, where it's booked into account, and finally a payment comes out. So this is just an example of how the process could look like. So here we have an invoice, it's being received by the access point, it's handed over to your e-invoicing solution, where the supplier is identified in the invoice, you know him, he's already registered in your system, in this case. Therefore, the invoice can be handed over to the one who did the purchase directly, looks at the invoice, yes, I did buy this iPhone, it's the price that I expected, it's okay. Perhaps it's escalated to my boss to say, yes, he was allowed to buy this iPhone. And then finally, it's been booked into account and the invoice is paid. And there is a business term in the European standard called buyer reference, which is, when using PEPL, this or the order reference is mandatory. So at least one of them must be provided in the invoice. So this is typically, it's in paper invoices, perhaps you know, your contact or your reference, typically you have it on paper invoices. So this is the field that the invoicing workflow is using to automatically forward the invoice to the correct person directly. So you don't have a need to have someone to intervene, to look at the invoice, and so this is probably the IT department, or this is him or her. You know, with this reference, the invoice can go directly to the correct person. So that is one approach. Another one is when you have, for example, telecom or utility invoices, or if you have washing services, or in health you might have different type of subscriptions of goods, or different types of contracts where the invoices just comes in monthly. And there is then in many of these e-invoicing solutions, you are able to register an object, like my phone subscription. That is an object, and I can configure that object in my e-invoicing system, saying that if the invoice is below 50 euros, then it's okay. So when the invoice is received, it's matched against this object, the telephones, and it was below 50 euros, it's automatically approved and paid without manual intervention at all. Only if it deviates from these rules, then it's escalated up into the workflow where a user will have to see, well, why is this phone bill so high? We have examples of big organizations who also have a lower limit on their phone bill. So if it's below 20 euros perhaps, it will also be escalated. So therefore, the invoices, phones that were never used were identified automatically. So if they were below 20 euros, obviously no one, or I don't know exactly the amount, but then the invoice was probably in a drawer somewhere, perhaps someone on parental leave or someone on, so they could start to shutting down subscriptions of phones and save a lot of money just identifying them that way. They're kind of smart. And we have something called an invoiced object identifier. It's a specific business term in the European standard. It has a specific field, and that is the purpose here is for this type of matching. And finally, we have ordered invoice, and that is when you have a purchasing order in your system, you have issued the order. Either you send it to your supplier electronically, or you might call him or send an email, whatever, it doesn't really matter. As long as the supplier enters the order number on the invoice, so when you receive it, you can match it towards your order object in your system. And the European standard has this order reference. Also on line level, you can refer to order lines. So each invoice line can point to an order line. And if you have a goods or when you receive goods, if you have a process where you approve that, so that you also in your system know that you did receive the goods, so then you know that I have an order, I have received the goods, and the invoice corresponds, the amounts corresponds, then it can be paid automatically. Of course, this requires both change in your way of working, and you also need to have systems that have these capabilities. I give you an example. Yeah, and also, if there's an unknown customer, now we're talking about this long tail. So suddenly you will receive an invoice from a supplier that you haven't already registered. Perhaps it's a new contract, so it's a new relationship. And you receive an invoice, and you should have a process which stops that invoice and make you aware of it so that you can have a controlled way of registering and approving the supplier before handing it out in your workflow for approval. That's also an important thing. Here's an example of a city, Skövde in Sweden, 50,000 citizens. They have 125,000 invoices in 2018 was this. So 125,000 invoices. About 20% were still paper. But for the electronic invoices, 37% were workflow invoices, which were handled in the workflow using the buyer reference as the key. The order-matched invoices was 25% because they are purchasing all the school kitchen supplies, food and things like that, all the office supplies in an electronic ordering system. 25% taken care of by order matching. And then the periodical, like the phone subscription and utilities, that was about 20%. And looking at this, many of the ones in the first line, the buyer reference, can potentially be automated. So even though they have 80% electronic invoicing here, there's still a big potential of digitalizing or improving on their side. So it's not black and white. Either you have e-invoicing or you have not. So even if you have e-invoicing and have high volumes, you can still continue to work on making more and more value out of those relationships. But it takes some time. And finally, so when you come here, so now we are in the last step here, you have full e-procurement, electronic orders and catalogs, which means that you can make sure that you order the correct items and the contracted items, not only from the contracted supplier, but from the contracted items that you have on your contract. Using the correct price in a simple way so that you get the correct items at the correct time in a controlled way. You get a dispatch advice so that you are ready on the dock when the lorry is coming, perhaps, if you're a big organization. And for the invoice, you get automating approval, which makes it possible to pay in time and correctly booked into account. And all of that, of course, leads to a lot of benefits for your organization. Lower prices, you stay more loyal to your contracted, procured suppliers, you get a more rational process, better cash management, better security, because you know more, you have traces of more of your business interactions. It's environmental friendly, as Christian brought up, and also it strengthens the business relationships with your suppliers. So these are some of the benefits, and it's a long way going, and we shouldn't have expectations to just suddenly be up there. It's a long process, but enormous potential.
For some of the countries, it has taken them 10 to 15 years just to reach the third or fourth step, and very few, very few, not to anchor your response in the next questions, but very few have actually reached the final step up there and also gained full value from that.
Yeah. But also now the tools available in the market is much more competent now than compared to 15, 20 years ago. So those countries who are entering into this area now have a lot of benefits. So even if it took 20 years for one country, if they would start over again now, it would be much quicker because the suppliers have more modern tools and so on. But we have one question on the Slido, and that question is, where would you point yourself to be? In which of these steps are you? And so if you move over to the Slido.
So on the top, you will be on the first step of the ladder, second, third, fourth, and fifth step.
So now, unfortunately, the tool is sorting these, so they're not coming up in the same order as the ladder. It's kind of confusing, but we can see clearly here that most of you are working on the compliance part. That is the priority now. Some on the next to build knowledge. But we also see that we have a few participants here who have reached quite far in their in this process, which was also indicated by the questions we received earlier. So that is corresponding to that. Okay.
So that's it from our side.
Yeah, perhaps we have
right now,
more. Is it questions, or do we have time?
Or do we have time for?
2 or 3 maybe on Slido.
Okay. Can we do a few questions on Slido?
And thank you for all the questions. It's always nice to have. 36. That's
okay. If we take the one, what are the costs for suppliers to set up to send? That it from 0 and up. There are free tools available to send electronic invoices. It can be that it's free up to a certain number of invoices a month and so on, or so portals like that. But a big company that want to have an integration in their ERP or billing system directly, then the price, it can be quite high. So which one should we take? For central government bodies, how many PEPL compliant invoices are being processed since they go live April? Okay, that's a good question. It's not for us, but...
Do you have this?
We don't have the figure, but I think it's quite low.
It's quite low, yeah. So, for small bodies, what are the likely costs going? Are we talking about public?
Just so there is a caveat on that. There is an invoicing system in the education sector, and they are processed, I think, over 100,000 invoices. So that's probably our big success story in terms of a body that's enabled it. I'm not sure if everybody can hear me, so it might.
Okay, so in the educational sector, there's an organization that has quite good numbers and.
Quite a significant effort to onboard suppliers.
Okay. All right, so they are good.
Can you tell us what suppliers are you using? It would be good for us to know what suppliers are in a position to produce PEPL compliant invoices.
Suppliers, Irish suppliers that can send.
If we're a
Yeah, perhaps you can.
I'll take that one for you. We have some utilities on board and some IT suppliers. They're the predominant groupings that we have. And we can take that one offline then so give you more information. It's okay. That's fine.
Okay, but good. There's someone here who knows the details here, so you can perhaps network. I think the first questions we already answered, and that one is also answered. What obligation does the public sector to issue? There is no. The directive relates to public procurement, so there is. Normally, public entities are not bidders in public procurement tenders. So there is no, in that sense, requirement for you to send electronic invoice. But of course, it's a good idea to do it anyway. Yeah. Okay.
Sorry, Martin. Sorry. In fact, situations do arise where other European public bodies are being invoiced by Irish public bodies, and those public bodies actually do request for the invoice to come electronically, and I know that the Institute of Technology accounting department actively engaged and did send out the invoices electronically in the correct format.
Okay.
So we need to break now. So thank you.
Thank you so much. This was our part for now.